Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists. I'm your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. If you're tuning in right now, you can view this webinar on both YouTube and LinkedIn. However, I strongly recommend that you subscribe to Mongabay's YouTube channel so that you can be notified when this webinar is edited after we're done here today, and also when our next one is planned. And you can also get notifications about our webinar series by subscribing to Mongabay's newsletter, which can be found on the opportunities page at mongabay.org. So today's webinar topic is a very large one. It is planetary health. It's a transdisciplinary field analyzing humans' impact on Earth's systems and how those impact human health. It's a very, very broad field, increasingly vital to environmental and health journalism, and there's a ton of it to cover. So we hope that today's discussion will give you a pretty robust primer on the subject, whether you're a journalist, a reader, or a consumer of environmental news. So like usual, we're going to do a 10-question Q&A format, and then towards the end of the discussion, we'll address as many audience questions as we have time for. So if you think of something during the broadcast, go ahead and drop it in on the chat that you're tuning in on. Both LinkedIn and YouTube have the function for you to leave a question, and then at the end of the hour, I will bring it up with our panelists. So as a reminder, if you're a journalist, Mongabay is always seeking your pitches. If you have a story idea, please send us your pitch under the corresponding special reporting project, which you can also find at the opportunities page at mongabay.org. However, we do encourage you to pitch your story ideas to other outlets if you're not going to pitch them to us. And that's it. So now that we've covered that very important housekeeping, I want to go ahead and introduce our fabulous panel for today, starting with Sam Myers. Sam is the faculty director of the Planetary Health Alliance and the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health, and is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is the co-editor with Howard Frumkin of Planetary Health, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves, which was voted one of the 25 best books of all time by the American Journal of Health Promotion in 2021. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here with you. Thanks a lot.
And also joining us is journalist and lecturer Mark Schapiro. Mark is an award-winning investigative reporter, author, and lecturer at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. His work has been published in Harper's, Mother Jones, Yale 360, The Nation, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Los Angeles Times, and many others. His most recent book, Seeds of Resistance: The Fight to Save Our Food Supply, investigates the epic struggle to control the seeds of food crops capable of resilience to climate change. Mark, pleasure to have you here.
Great to be here. Greetings from California.
So just to recap, we're going to give each panelist an opportunity to answer each of the 10 questions that we have, and then at the end, we're going to hold a audience Q&A, and we'll answer questions as time allows. So if you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we'll address it at the end. And don't worry if you don't catch all of this webinar, you will be able to view it on demand on our YouTube channel within 48 hours of this broadcast. Timestamps will be included, as well as any resources that are shared today. And if you registered for this webinar, you'll be receiving a publication notice directly into your inbox, along with a brief survey. And we will publish a link to this webinar on the blog at mongabay.org. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the Planetary Health Alliance states, planetary health is a solutions-oriented, transdisciplinary field and social movement focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems on human health and all of life on Earth. So panelists, can you elaborate on the planetary health field movement and why it emerges at this moment and why its context is so crucial for environmental reporting?
Sure, I'll take a crack at that, Mike. Thank you. I think, the field is quite young. It sort of dates back to the release of the Rockefeller-Lancet Commission report in 2015 called Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene. And I think it emerges now the sort of core tenet is that the global Earth crisis is driving human health and humanitarian crisis. And it's almost like we've been sort of feeling the parts of an elephant, and we've been reporting these different facets of the Earth crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, land use change, marine system degradation, resource scarcity, all these different things as if they're all discrete and independent. And there's been kind of this awakening, particularly in the global health community, that in fact, those are all interconnected parts of an Earth crisis, and that it's not an environmental problem anymore. It's a sort of human survival and existential problem, and that all of these transformations of our planet's natural life support systems have become a sort of urgent threat to our own health and well-being.
Thanks very much.
That's so interesting. I so much appreciate the holistic approach of the Planetary Health Alliance, which I think is just slowly kind of reaching into the global consciousness. I think what actually educated me about this, about how to think about this, is, I wrote a book called The End of Stationarity. It's this book. And what is stationarity? Stationarity is this phenomenon used by water scientists to determine the amount of precipitation coming from the atmosphere onto the Earth. And what they realized in looking back over several 100,000 years was that the past patterns of precipitation were no longer predictive of the future. This was a huge revelation that came out about 10, 12 years ago in Science magazine. And when you think about what that means, that has enormous consequence. And I think what it tells us is about the deep disturbances to past patterns on the Earth, the deep sense of disequilibrium that is happening in the kind of balancing act on Earth. And it helps us to understand, I think, the Earth as a kind of a singular organism. The Earth itself is an organism, a breathing system with a circulatory system, a respiratory system. And I think when we consider the health impacts of living in this kind of disturbed situation, I think it's helpful to think in that kind of context. So I approach this from a kind of a journalistic point of view, but that is where I think the enormous consequences that then follow the disequilibrium are the health consequences and other things that we'll probably get into in a little bit.
Great, thank you both. So we're going to move right along to the next question. What are the primary drivers of the effects on human health that we're experiencing today?
Wow. I can take a crack at that, but I think one of the key points, Mike, is that it's not any one isolated driver. So, for example, there's a very robust discussion in the United States on climate change and health, and really globally, and there are all these programs on climate and health. And the challenge with that is that you're isolating one of these very, very important drivers of sort of changing biophysical conditions, but you're doing it in isolation. And the core sort of point of planetary health is that we're not just changing the climate system, we're changing everything. So it's not climate change, it's everything change. And in fact, what's happening is that we're recognizing, just as we've sort of known for decades, that there are sort of important social and cultural and political determinants of health, we're recognizing that human health is nested in a set of ecological conditions, and we're changing those biophysical conditions at by far the fastest rate in the history of our species. And all these changes, whether it's climate change or biodiversity loss or global scale pollution or resource scarcity or biogeochemical cycles changing, like all of those changes are interacting with each other. And this is really important in complex ways that we're just starting to understand, but that affect the sort of foundational conditions for human health and well-being, like the quality and quantity of food we produce, or our air quality or water quality, or exposure to infectious diseases or extreme weather events, or even the habitability of some of the places that we live. And so to isolate, well, which driver is most important is very difficult, because they're all interacting and driving biophysical changes in important ways. And I think we'll get into that more in food systems, which is a great example of that. But certainly, changing climate, certainly biodiversity loss, certainly land use change and pollution, they all really matter, and they all are having major impacts across every dimension of human health.
I think that actually what Sam has just said is very helpful, and it's very helpful, I would say, also for journalists, because I think journalists, one of the things I realized in doing environmental reporting for many years, and even with an emphasis on investigative reporting, and there was something I realized in doing this environmental reporting, which is that I really needed to actually understand ecology. And I really needed to understand ecological sciences in order to understand why the disruption to the environment really matters. So I think, just to build on what Sam said, I think it's important for journalists to basically understand the fundamental elements of ecology, of the ecological sciences, to understand the basic way in which all elements of an ecosystem connect to one another. And I found this very helpful term, which actually comes from the natural sciences, from I think it's the field of wildlife conservation, which has a term called the trophic cascade, which is the descriptive phrase used to describe how basic different elements of an ecosystem connect to one another. And if you remove one or disrupt one of those elements, it's going to have consequences all the way down the line. And I think that's how journalists have to think about these health implications of this kind of disturbed planet that we're on, is to think of all the kind of consequences of all the other components of an ecosystem and how they may contribute to these health consequences, which gets to, like Sam said, the question of zoonotic diseases, of climate change is leading to a whole new rash of threats when it comes to infectious diseases, pests, bugs following the heat, etc. And I think it's important to actually think ecologically, if I can put it that way.
Just to jump in quickly and add to that, I think that's a great point. And it's something that we talk a lot about in the field, which is that a sort of overarching concept is systems thinking. And so even the notion of a primary driver is almost problematic, right? It sort of implies a linear way of thinking about things. But this is a very complex system that we're embedded in. And so as you change one element of it, you find these really surprising sort of unintended consequences in other places. And we can give some examples of that in sort of any area you want. But I think the idea that this is about complex systems is really important.
Thank you both for that important context. So with that said, briefly, I know that's hard to do in the time that we have. What are the human health effects that we are seeing because of this planetary disruption? And how can reporters cover those health effects with the aforementioned context in mind?
Well, geez, I don't know. There's a lot of there are new diseases coming our way, or there's actually a better way to frame that, because it's not like they're coming our way from nowhere. There is changes within the disease patterns that are occurring, whereas diseases or infectious infectious creatures infectious diseases are following the heat. And so things that may have been more common further south from here are beginning to make their way into the United States. I mean, most vividly here in California, for example, there's valley fever, which maybe people have spoken in some ways, which is actually carried by hot dust. And there's getting to be a lot more hot dust here in California, and it's a phenomenon that used to be pretty limited to the deep South Texas and northern Mexico and stuff. So there are numerous examples, and the Zeta virus, which people are probably pretty familiar with. I think so I would just kind of put those out as the Earth changes, diseases are following the changes in the atmosphere.
And I think it's really interesting. Our minds definitely go towards the infectious diseases, and that's where the popular press goes too. You know, we think about hot zone, and we think about, you know, these horrible new pathogens that are emerging, and obviously we're coming out of this pandemic. In fact, when you think about global burden of disease, what's going to, you know, kill and disable the most people as a result of our transformation of nature, it may well not be the infectious diseases. I mean, you know, nutrition is a huge area I think we'll talk more about later, but there are really dramatic impacts on not only the quantity of food that we can produce, but also the quality of food, which is an area that I do a lot of research. There are, you know, large impacts on non-communicable diseases. So there are about 9 million excess deaths every year from pollution of air, water, and soil. Most of those are from things like heart and lung disease and stroke. There are major impacts on mental health from not only the extreme events that we're seeing, like fires and storms and floods, but also from this sort of phenomenon of ecological grief or eco-anxiety, particularly in younger generations, where, you know, up to 50% of people aged 16 to 25 in 10 different countries reported that feelings, you know, awareness of environmental change was negatively affecting their daily life. We're seeing displacement and conflict. And so, you know, certainly infectious disease patterns are changing and in all kinds of interesting ways. But every other dimension of health is also being impacted, including nutrition, non-communicable diseases, mental health, displacement and conflict, trauma, et cetera. So it's really what dimension of health isn't being driven, you know, significantly, to the point where many of us are concerned that the majority of the global burden of disease by the end of this century will be driven by our own transformation of our natural systems.
Fantastic. Fantastic additions to that question, both. So we already started to actually talk about this one quite a bit, but if you have anything to add to it, please do. So we started to talk about infectious disease exposure. What's some really important context that journalists should be explaining to readers when covering this topic, other than the things that you have mentioned?
You know, if you think about, this is an area where it's sort of interesting to think about the different environmental drivers. So, you know, deforestation has been shown to lead to increased malaria in East Africa and South America. Damming of rivers is increasing the prevalence of schistosomiasis by just a huge amount, like up to 80% of people along rivers in West Africa. Hundreds of millions of people put at risk for schistosomiasis because of damming rivers. You know, more extreme precipitation events are causing more and more waterborne disease outbreaks like cholera. The pandemics that Mark was talking about, the sort of spillovers where pathogens jump from animal populations to human populations, occur as a result of human incursions into wildlife habitat and the bushmeat trade and the wildlife trade. And then there are these really interesting effects of the changing biological composition of communities. And as we remove biodiversity in systems because we fragment the habitat and we reduce habitat, For example, in New England, where I am right now, we see increased risk of Lyme disease in places with less diversity, with fewer species prevalent. So there's a variety of different mechanisms. And in fact, there was a really important paper published in April, led by Jason Rohr, in which they did a meta-analysis of over 3,000 papers that looked at different environmental drivers from climate, biodiversity loss, pollution, land use change, invasive species. And they found that across the board, all of those environmental drivers were associated with increased incidence of infectious diseases. So it's quite pervasive. And each of these mechanisms, and there's a whole field of disease ecology that explores these mechanisms, is really, really fascinating.
That's super interesting, Sam. I definitely want to see that paper. I haven't seen that paper. That would be really interesting to see that. I think you're making an interesting point too about the connection of biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity to the kind of the essentially what becomes a far more brittle ecological system. So when a disease breaks out in a ecological system that is not biodiverse, that is monochromatic, that is going to spread a lot quicker than a disease or an illness or an infection that is actually in a much more complicated biological system. And I think that's one of the ways to actually understand the importance of biodiversity, why biodiversity is key to kind of the building of kind of or the maintenance of resilient ecosystems. So it's this kind of disequilibrium that is contributing to the kind of health impacts that we're talking about here. And I want to make a point too in the bigger picture, and maybe we'll come back to this earlier, is that the way the economy is organized is it does not take account of these costs that we are talking about here, the costs, for example, of a monochromatic ecosystem that's lost its biodiversity. Well, the cost of that could be in the public health, in the certainly in the ecological health, in the ability to grow food on these kind of lands, but that is not taken account of in the economic system. So at some point, we as thinkers and journalists need to start thinking about how these qualities are valued in a way. And I think some of these abuses that we're talking about occur because we're not taking into account the externalized costs that are associated with industrial development and the other factors we're discussing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I couldn't agree more. And it's another one of these sort of overarching themes that we've focused on, is this idea of quantifying externalities. And I mean, we did work in Indonesia where we looked at biomass fires that drive these haze episodes. And we spent 10 years sort of quantifying the cumulative mortality from those haze episodes from the air pollution exposure. And ultimately showed that there are, about 35,000 deaths a year on average over the next several decades from the land use decisions that are getting made in Indonesia. And that, we actually could prevent 2/3 of that mortality with aggressive peatland restoration. And it became a way to actually put a figure to quantify that externality, so that suddenly, the palm oil and timber industries that were considered a great positive for the Indonesian economy started to look like kind of a negative if you value those lives. And so, that's just one tiny example, but over and over, I totally agree that trying to quantify these externalities becomes really important from a policy standpoint.
Great, thank you both. And put a pin in air quality, because we're going to come back to that one real soon. But first, let's talk about extreme weather. So what extreme weather events, such as like heat or cold or hazards, have the most significant impact on human health? Are there ones right now that you think urgently need more coverage than they're getting?
Well, there's so many. What are you talking about? There's so many. They just keep coming at us every day. Today was floods in Florida. You know, a week ago it was insane heat in Phoenix and Las Vegas, and it's really hard to put a finger. I just think it's gotten to be crazy. Just the sequence that are happening more and more. I think first of all we need to kind of completely eliminate this term from our vocabulary of natural disasters, because of course there's always been cyclones, there've always been hurricanes, there've always been storms, there've always been rainstorms. We all know that. And But I think we need to really take a look in terms of journalism as how do you describe these events, because it's clear that the intensity, the frequency of these extreme events are happening significantly because of the altered climate as a result of the accumulation of fossil fuels, and it's essentially clear who's responsible for that. So I think in terms of how we write about that, I think it's important to actually try to capture the level of responsibility from the accumulation of fossil fuels. And I am not suggesting that each flood is created by climate change. That's ridiculous. We all know that's been happening. It goes back thousands of years in human history. But there's a great source that I encourage all journalists to reference, which is the field of attribution sciences, which is really easy to find. If you just go attribution science, I think it's the first thing that pops up on Google. And they're a group of scientists who attempt to really do rigorous analysis as to the contributions of climate change, in this case, to these extreme events that we're talking about. I think can be really, really useful to journalists who are going to be writing about the displacement and the impacts of these kind of events. So to say which is worse or the other, I'm not even quite sure, but there are a lot coming, and it's important to describe these events accurately, and when possible to actually articulate what the responsible forces are that are contributing to these extreme events.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. I guess I would say a couple other things in addition. One is that we look at these events as sort of discrete events, oh, there's a wildfire, problem in Canada this year, there's a flood in Florida, etc. And we look at the immediate impacts of those events. But again, going back to this idea of complex systems, often these extreme events precipitate a whole chain of responses. So for example, the civil war in Syria that's driven this, huge refugee crisis and, had knock-on effects in geopolitics all over the world was precipitated by the worst drought on the instrumental record in history. Flooding a couple of years ago in Pakistan displaced 33 million people. And so that, yes, the flooding was bad as an acute event, but then the displacement associated with that had huge effects on health and income and, the stability of those families. In Bangladesh, the combination of sea level rise and more extreme storms and also sort of poor upstream water resource management is leading to all of this intrusion of salt water into the coastal aquifers. And that's leading to much higher rates of eclampsia in pregnant women and hypertension in coastal dwelling adults in Bangladesh, which is directly correlated to the salinity of the groundwater that they're drinking. And so again, these sort of complex systems effects that you might not anticipate are really fascinating. So one point is just that, you see the event right in front of you, but then look at all the sort of ripple effects of that. The other thought is that this is a perfect place to highlight a critical, one more of these overarching principles, which is, equity and justice, and that when you're looking at who's impacted by these extreme events around the world, uniformly, it's the poorest people in the world who have the poorest infrastructure around them, the poorest sort of government services, the least well-functioning governance, the least access to philanthropy, et cetera, et cetera. And so that highlights another one of these issues where the people who are bearing the burden of degraded natural systems across the planet are sort of categorically different from the people who are really benefiting from the activities that are transforming those systems. And so those of us in the wealthy world are driving activities that are putting the poorest people in the world, future generations, indigenous communities, non-human beings, into harm's way. And that's just profoundly unfair. And so it's important to sort of be aware, I think, of that issue of environmental justice as well.
Yeah, so you've just captured the essential dynamic of climate change, like in 2 sentences, I think, in terms of the deep equity implications. And just to build on that very quickly, is I just think it's a really good point. And just to remember for the journalists among us, I certainly try to remember it. I try to pass it on to my students and stuff, is this idea that the story is that, yes, there's a story in the disaster and you go cover the disaster because that's important to be there. But then go back, find out what's happened to all those people who've been displaced and can't go back to their homes, or maybe somehow experiencing health implications from their changed circumstances, because the disaster doesn't end when the wind stops blowing and the water stops flowing. It keeps going, having these enormous ripple effects. And it's really worth keeping that in mind when you're telling these.
Just very quickly, there's a very rich literature going back to these disaster areas. And for example, in Hurricane Katrina, people that went back to New Orleans 15 years later still found elevated rates of suicidality, anxiety, depression, joblessness, et cetera. And that's true really across the board. So it's a great point, going back to these mental health effects, but across the board, these are durable impacts that you see after these disasters.
Great, thank you both. So we're moving on to our next topic, which is a pretty big one, and it's air quality. So just some context for folks here. So the UNFCCC says that air quality kills more people per year than HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. And the World Health Organization says that 99% of the global population lives in areas where the air quality exceeds WHO limits. So that's quite large and pervasive. So some people are suggesting that solutions-oriented journalism to highlight how communities are adapting to this is needed. However, given how widespread this problem is there another avenue of journalism that journalists should explore here that could have more impact?
To be totally honest, I don't know I really have no idea how a community adapts to air pollution. I mean, this is something that it depends how big a community. If you're talking about a massive city of 10 million people, then yes, then they can. Then there's governing authorities who can actually work to reduce pollution, as happened in Los Angeles, which is where I grew up, and I did see the air pollution from all the cars and everything get reduced when you're in a city. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how and you might have insights into this. I'm not quite sure how a community, when I hear community, I think of a small community. I think of, like, here's what it makes me think of. I'm doing this to basically make a larger point, hopefully, which is that here in California, we have one of the primary corridors for delivering packages. As everybody knows, and the pandemic and everything, anyway, there's a massive delivery of people are getting their packages delivered either to their homes or to local distribution centers and stuff. Huge multi-billion-dollar industry has emerged really over the past 5, 6, 7 years of overnight deliveries and such. And a lot of those trucks that actually deliver the goods are passing right by these very poor communities, largely Latino in Southern California. And so they are adapting to the, first of all, there are very high rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses as a result of their proximity to the highway, which is the primary highway that goes from the port of Long Beach deeper into the state of California with all these products. So there's a couple things that raises. Number one, they were finding these very high rates of asthma and such in young children because an elementary school happened to be located very close to that highway coming out of Long Beach. And so, yes, that school is adapting by having more classes indoors and installing air filters to the school. But is this the right way to be thinking when you have a nonstop caravan of major trucks with boxes loaded up in the back that are going to be disseminated to people across the state? You know, if you are getting one of these delivery services. So the question is really, how do you deal with the primary drivers of this situation? Do you have tighter regulations on the emissions that come out of those trucks? That would be one response, which is not a community response, that is a state response. It demands governing authority. Do you also push for changes in people's sensibilities as to whether they need overnight delivery or, you know, super fast delivery? Is this something that's essential to modern life, which is actually exponentially raising the number of these trucks on the highway? So I think there are a number of questions that come up in relation to this issue.
No, I think that's right. You know, if you stop and think about what's causing air pollution around the world, it's really sort of archaic technologies at this point, right? It's coal-fired power, it's, you know, biomass burning in the homes of the sort of, you know, billion or so people who are too poor to use anything else for fuel and don't have access to electricity, and its internal combustion engines. All of those technologies are sort of archaic, and so they emphasize the need for the sort of rapid structural changes in how we live that are happening sort of in front of our eyes. I mean, we're in the middle of this sort of renewable energy revolution that's happening faster than anybody predicted, and it needs to happen even faster. But it brings up an interesting dimension of the conversation, which is this whole area of co-benefits, that the transition away from these archaic technologies is very, very important from the standpoint of addressing climate change. But it's also very important in terms of addressing air quality and the 9 million deaths a year that occur as a result of both indoor and outdoor air pollution. And so, finding ways to electrify homes and get away from biomass burning in homes in poorer countries, replacing coal-fired power with renewables, building our cities to encourage active transport and public transport, and reducing cars and trucks, and then electrifying the fleet of cars and trucks. Those are all things that are meaningful from the standpoint of addressing climate change. They're also things that have huge health co-benefits in terms of increased physical activity and improved air quality and more cohesive and socially connected cities. And so that's a really, really important dimension of many of these planetary health topics, which is that the kinds of solutions that are out there and available are also things that we would want to be doing even if we weren't in the midst of an Earth crisis that was driving a health and humanitarian crisis. And I think that's something that is somehow sometimes underreported. I would also say that there's a governance dimension. Mark mentioned that, what can a community do? And I think it can be challenging for communities to have real agency over air pollution. But there are a lot of things that can be done. I mean, the sort of case studies of China and India over the last 30 years around air pollution are quite striking, where, 20 or 30 years ago, both countries were struggling with massive air pollution that was causing significant mortality. And then China decided to do something about it. And air quality has dramatically improved in cities in China as a result of government intervention. India has been completely unsuccessful at making real inroads into air quality in its cities. And there are huge morbidity and mortality implications of that. So effective governance is another important dimension.
Fantastic responses, both. Moving on to our next question then, and it's on harmful substances, which I'm going to include endocrine disrupting chemicals in. So just some context here for listeners. If you aren't already aware, scientists and doctors are raising the alarm over potentially thousands of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the environment that were not studied before they entered the market. Rising rates of cancer, infertility, and obesity are suspected to be at least partially attributable to the presence of endocrine disruptors in the human body. So as the literature on this is quite alarming and recent, what are the biggest concerns journalists should keep in mind when they're covering this topic?
Okay, I did write a book on this topic, as it happens, which I know was not sure, but I wrote a book called Exposed. And the reason I mention that is that in this book, I describe the regulatory approach to endocrine disrupting chemicals, as well as carcinogens and mutagens, and compare the approach between the United States and the European Union. And what's very interesting about that is that, and I think this is actually helpful for journalists, because you have two different regulatory approaches in two economies that are comparable to one another. It's fair to say, I think the United States and European Union have comparable economies, sophistication, levels of affluence, education, etc. And yet the EU has a very different approach to chemicals, which they call the precautionary principle, which is essentially, if there's to oversimplify this, but basically to say, if there's a suspicion of danger from a particular substance, it needs to be either restricted or in some cases banned. And the United States has much weaker regulations when it comes to that. One of the results of that situation is that products that are banned in the European Union because of their dangers to the human health of their population are actually perfectly legal to sell in the United States. And for this is, of course, a real flip of the dynamic where years ago it was the United States that was sending banned products overseas to developing countries. Now the United States is receiving products that are banned elsewhere and for sale here. The reason that matters is because we are talking specifically about endocrine disrupting chemicals, as well as carcinogens and mutagens. And when it comes to journalists covering these questions, the one thing I would suggest is that one of the big battles over regulating a chemical, whatever country you are in, and I know not all of our people here are from either Europe or the United States, but for those who aren't, I think your governments are either more closely aligned either with the United States or the European Union, and it's actually worth thinking through the health implications of those alliances. But when a regulation on a chemical is proposed, the argument, at least in the United States, is often by the industry that this will cost jobs, this will send us out of business, this is going to be too expensive, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing to do for journalists is, because these are often global industries. So the question, rather than accepting that argument, analyze how that same company often has a branch in the European Union or elsewhere in the world, and that same industry is doing under a more rigorous system. And what I found in doing this book a couple of years ago, and I think it's still the case, is that you find that when regulations are imposed, there's very little economic impact. And in fact, markets often grow because there's a wider perception that these products are safer. So journalistically, important not to accept the arguments of those companies that are actually producing products with those endocrine disrupting chemicals. And the final thing I'll say about that is, one of the interesting reasons for the EU's more rigorous approach, I'm by no means kind of waving a flag for the EU, I'm just suggesting that there is this profound difference. And one of them is that there is a public health service in the European Union, which doesn't really exist in the United States, which gives the government a vested financial interest in the health of their population. And that's just a quick response to this question.
I didn't write a book on this subject, so I'm not going to say as much, but I will just add one sort of interesting example of harmful substances, which is chlorofluorocarbons, which are really the best example that we've had of taking sort of global planetary health action, where we recognize that those chlorofluorocarbons were degrading the ozone, the high ozone layer, and causing the hole in the ozone layer, particularly there in Australia. And industry was saying all the things that Mark just said, that it was too expensive, there were no replacements. And then after the Montreal Protocol, where there was basically an agreement that we couldn't destroy the ozone layer, they very quickly found what turned out to be cheaper replacements. And there was, none of the sort of apocalyptic predictions from industry happened. And now the ozone layer is getting progressively more and more repaired and whole. And so it's a first example of multilateral global agreement and action to protect the planetary system, to preserve our own health. And so it's worth keeping that in our minds as we think about these big issues.
Love that example you just gave, Sam. And Mark, that was fantastic advice about that, examining the industry argument. Such great advice. I really appreciate that. The next question we're going to examine, the next topic, is changing food systems. So some context for listeners and viewers. The United Nations World Food Program reports that 783 million people face chronic hunger. Global food insecurity has risen since pre-pandemic levels. Multiple exacerbating factors are involved in this crisis, including climate change and war, and conflict is cited as the biggest driver, according to the United Nations. So, what do the changes to our food systems that are currently happening look like, with additional ecological and climate shocks yet to come?
Jump in here because this is where I do all of my research, and it's complex, right? So when you think about the global food system, whether you're talking about agriculture or livestock or fisheries, our food system has developed over the last thousands of years to be optimal under what have been a very stable set of biophysical conditions, right? And so now we're changing those conditions very dramatically, and we're seeing impacts across every dimension of our food systems. The data that you describe of food insecurity rising, it actually started well before the pandemic. So we'd had sort of decades of success in reducing hunger globally up until about 2014. And then that trend over several decades reversed, and we've seen food insecurity rise every year since then. So it predates the pandemic. It predates the war in Ukraine. And many of us believe that destabilized environmental conditions are a major driver. Let me give you just a few very quick, maybe one-sentence examples from our own research of just what that can look like. So in our research, we've shown that rising concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually change the nutritional content of staple food crops and are responsible for falling levels of iron, zinc, and protein in staple crops like rice and wheat. And that the changes that we anticipate by the next sort of middle of this century as a result of just rising CO2 alone is likely to push 150 to 200 million people around the world into deficiencies of those nutrients, which have big health consequences, in addition to exacerbating sort of existing micronutrient deficiencies in about 1 billion people. In another example, we've shown that not having enough pollinators, so in this case, a biodiversity problem, not having enough wild pollinators, insects, bees, flies, birds, actually is leading to about 500,000 deaths every year because we don't produce as many fruits and vegetables and nuts as we need to prevent heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and certain cancers. So again, a very sort of complex systems interaction, but we depend on the wild pollinators for those kinds of foods, which are actually really important in protecting us from those non-communicable diseases. We've shown that about 1 billion people around the world depend on wild harvested fish to get adequate intakes of key nutrients like iron, zinc, B12, vitamin A, omega-3 fatty acids. And those billion people who depend on those wild harvested fish live close to a threshold of insufficient intake and get at least 20% of their intake from those fish. So we see that as the sort of vulnerable population to having less access to wild harvested fisheries at the same time that ocean warming is reducing the size of fisheries and also, most importantly, moving the fisheries away from the tropics and out toward the poles, in the same way that agriculture is moving away from the tropics and out toward the poles. And so in this case, ocean warming is disconnecting the people who need those nutrients from the fish and the fisheries that supplied them. And this is a common trend around the world, that most of the population growth we anticipate for the rest of this century will be in cities, primarily cities in Africa, in the tropics. And yet food production is moving away from the tropics and toward the poles. And so we're seeing a bigger and bigger disconnect between where the people are going to be and where the food is going to be. And of course, that means we have more and more reliance on a global food trade system, which has been shown to function in a very perverse way in response to climate shocks, where climate shocks lead to sort of protectionist policies where countries shut down exports in order to stabilize prices internally for geopolitical reasons, but that actually amplify the price shocks. And so we have a food trade system that does not function efficiently in terms of getting food where it needs to be, and is also very fragile in response to climate shocks. Oh, and by the way, climate shocks are becoming more extreme and more frequent. And so it's a very vulnerable system that we're looking at sort of across the board. And the key point is that it's not only the climate change that's driving changes in the quality and quantity of food production, but all of these other kinds of changes like water scarcity, arable land degradation, loss of pollinators, et cetera, that are actually affecting quality and quantity of food we can produce.
Wow. Well, I'm really appreciating the kind of holistic approach that my co-panelist here takes in this discussion, and just want to just add a little bit to the discussion about food systems. Amazing enough, I did write a book on this question. It's called Seeds of Resistance. That's it for the books. I've only written 3, and this is the most recent one, Seeds of Resistance, and it's about where the seeds are that are resilient to climate change and the struggle to control them. But the main thing to mention in this context is that the current food system, the industrial food system, was really designed with a set of fixed kind of conditions in mind. So, as people probably know, there's been very rapid consolidation in the agriculture industries over the last 25, 30 years. And now it's gotten to the point where basically 4 companies control 60% of all commercial seeds. And what's interesting about that is that those seeds are bred for a specific set of conditions and boosted along the way by large quantities of agricultural chemicals. And what they've done is replaced many local varieties that had the ability to adapt. And one of the things that's happening now is because the seeds and the crops have been bred for a certain very precise set of conditions, and those conditions, as you all no doubt know, are rapidly changing. That's the whole point about really it's climate change. We call it climate change, or probably the best way to describe it is climate volatility. Incredible volatility in terms of rainfall, in terms of heat, in terms of extreme events, and etc. So the question is, what kind of food growing practices do we have that are most able to kind of respond to these shifting conditions? And I think that kind of requires a change in the kind of way that food is grown. And a lot of studies have been done on that, a lot of huge amount of documentation. If you're interested, journalistically speaking, I'd recommend things like agronomy journals and things like that, which are reporting on the declining yields of industrial agriculture and the relative performance of far more biodiverse fields that have far more diversity within them and return organic materials to the soil rather than extract them without a replenishment occurring. So this is a huge question, and it gets to the matter of how the current industrial agriculture system is performing within the context of enormous climate volatility. But just to throw that out there, and journalistically, I think if wherever you might be, I know I could see some of you in the chat. Hello Brazil, hello Malawi, and all over the world. Wherever you are, you can find this data in the reports done by scientists or the government about the performance of those varieties, and particularly in comparison with other ways of growing. So just to throw that into the mix here.
One other thing that might be worth saying and is important to sort of be aware of, I think, particularly for journalists, is that this conversation is sort of bidirectional, right? So we're talking about how rapidly changing biophysical conditions are affecting food production, food quality, food insecurity, micronutrient deficiencies, sort of the health impacts of biophysical changes as mediated through the food system. But it's also important to note that the single biggest driver of biophysical change on the planet is our food system, right? So, we're using 40% of the ice-free terrestrial land surface for croplands and pasture. We're using half the accessible fresh water on the planet, mostly to irrigate our crops. We're, fishing 90% of fisheries at or well beyond maximum sustainable limits. So the size, the footprint of the food system is enormous. It drives about a quarter to a third of greenhouse gas emissions. It's the major driver of biodiversity loss and land use change. So, and a lot of pollution as well. And so the challenge that we face as a global society is sort of threading this needle of how do we provide nutritious diets to 10 billion people without destroying the biosphere in the process. And that means, working in both directions of that set of relationships.
So, complicating the situation further here is the subject of water scarcity. So this obviously interacts with our changing food systems and everything else we've discussed. But according to our recent reporting here at Mongabay from a Nature paper that was released on this, nitrogen pollution could intensify global water scarcity threefold by 2050. And there's a lot of contributing factors to this. But there's also a critical lack of water monitoring systems in many countries. The United Nations says exploring, using, and protecting groundwater will be essential to adapting to this problem. Panelists, what are angles of this issue that need further coverage that you want reporters to keep in mind? Are there other solutions that journalists should be looking into or highlighting regarding this issue?
Well, this is a pretty big one. Gets to the pretty basic ingredient of all life, of course, water. Um, you know, we might want to pay attention to how native communities have addressed water scarcity in extremely dry environments. And I think there's actually growing attention on, I know here in the United States in the Southwest, it's the Navajo and Hopi approach to growing food in very dry environments, all sorts of systems for capturing water and breeding plants that actually are capable of surviving drought and stuff. I think that's number one. Number two, you mentioned nitrogen pollution. I think actually putting serious efforts to reducing nitrogen pollution. I've done a lot of reporting in Iowa, amazingly enough, and those, basically the majority of the rivers in Iowa have been just polluted beyond repair, or maybe can be repaired, but polluted beyond use by the excess nitrogen flowing off those fields. And I think there's been an interesting, and it's worth pursuing, is that France, I think, is actually the first country that is actually creating a bit of a penalty on farmers who overuse nitrogen. It's the first time I've really heard anything like this. And I think it'd actually be really interesting to see what the impacts of those restrictions are on both the use of nitrogen, but also the impacts on yield, which is always the argument to use more nitrogen-based fertilizers. Also, this gets to the question of how food is grown, and there are ways to grow food that is far more absorbent of water. The water doesn't just run off, and I've seen many experiments about or more organically rich soils far more absorbent of water. And the final thing I would put, and I'll turn this over to Sam, is that water should be, I think, as a public good, this is the most essential ingredient to all life. So I think actually stressing the idea that water is for the public is not something to be privately speculated on or controlled is probably an important contribution to water conservation.
Yeah, I agree. It's an enormous topic, and it's a hard one to get a bead on. As somebody who's not a hydrologist or a water expert, I've followed the topic for a long time. In the 1990s, there were some very, very dire predictions about the extent of water scarcity and how many billions of people were going to live in severely water restricted areas. There was sort of a shift in that conversation over the last sort of 15 years where water efficiencies were sort of built into the system, and suddenly it looked like those numbers got a whole lot better. There are people like Peter Glick and the Water Institute that follow this, the World Water Report, every year. So they're good resources for reporters to track, what's happening at a global scale. In terms of your question about interventions, there's a lot that can be done. So I mentioned water efficiency. Of course, water efficiency is attached to policies and pricing. So places where we put a price on water, people are a whole lot more efficient with it. And then we have these really bizarre, policies like in the desert Southwest of this country, where there are water rights to flood, deserts to grow rice, like in Arizona, that just make absolutely no sense at all. And so that's a policy or governance problem, but there's a lot of potential to improve the use of water and water efficiency. There's also a need in the setting of what we've talked about earlier, these much more extreme precipitation episodes where we're seeing extreme droughts and extreme rainfall events, to smooth that curve by impounding water, by storing it, so that when there's a lot of it, we capture it, and then we can use it when there isn't a lot of it, because those that variability is becoming more extreme. And so there's interesting work to think about how we impound water, either by recharging aquifers, which is a great way to do it because it doesn't evaporate, or with things like reservoirs. And the last point I'd make is that it's not just a volume or a quality problem. Those are big problems. Do we have enough, and are we polluting it? But it's also a timing problem. And there's a huge issue happening where we're seeing the melting of winter snowpack in mountain regions happen earlier and earlier. And as a result, it's sort of disconnecting the timing of the flow from the summer growing season when it's most needed. And there are places like the Indus River where, half the dry season flow of that river is coming from Himalayan glaciers, which are, very rapidly retreating. And so there are big questions about what you do when that seasonal snowpack, or in this case, glacier pack, is gone, and how we address this issue of the timing of flow. And so it's really important to start thinking about the kinds of engineering projects that will allow us to store the water when it comes. Look at LA right now, right? We've had these incredible floods, but if we could store that water and use it in times of drought, it would be a lot more effective.
Great. Thank you both. We have one more question, and then we're going to get to the audience Q&A. So audience, if you're listening right now, watching, go ahead and feel free to drop a question in, and we will address it after this last question here. But our next and final topic is migration and displacement. A little off-the-cuff information here. I just saw on the news that Panama is, evacuating an island or two for the first time in its history due to rising sea levels. So there's some migration and displacement occurring there. But there's obviously other ways in which migration and displacement can happen, such as extreme heat potentially. So panelists, what are some critical human health impacts and risks from this increased human migration and displacement? Are there ones that are super urgent that you recommend journalists cover right now?
I wouldn't even want to jump. I wouldn't even want to. I could not identify like a particularly health risk that this is. I think the risk is to the psyche of Americans and Europeans as they wake up, hopefully, to the fact that the climate disruptions that are occurring in other places are contributing to people being forced to leave their land because they can no longer sustain themselves on it. And so I would phrase this this is a deeply, deeply poignant theme, actually, of the climate disrupted world that we're in, that it is contributing to conditions that are making it more and more and more difficult to survive off the land. And we see this here in the United States, you see it in Mexico and Central America, entire areas no longer able to sustain farming or coffee production. In places like Panama, you just mentioned, the sea is rising. And so the question there is, what is the, I think I think it's the public health impact of an issue that has become a political question in the United States and in Europe that I think needs to be examined. And when writing about it, journalists, I think, should be clear as to what the contributing factors are, since immigration is a huge question, obviously, here in Europe, United States and in Europe. And I think journalists need to write about that with enormous sensitivity and knowledge as to what people face when they are forced to leave their land. So I think that's the main question in terms of what this raises.
Yeah, I guess, and I would add a few things. I mean, it's actually been pretty well studied what the health impacts of migration and displacement are. I'd start by saying that for the last 10 or 11 years, every single year has broken records from the history of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees monitoring of displaced people. And in over that 10-year period, the number of displaced people has doubled. So there's an extraordinary rise in displaced people. Last year, I think it was 116 million people displaced, half of those children. So this is a very, very large population that we're talking about. Displacement leads to malnutrition. It leads to epidemic infectious disease, particularly outbreaks of things like measles and respiratory diseases, as well as waterborne diseases like cholera. It leads to trauma, physical, psychological, sexual trauma, particularly girls and young women. Huge mental health impacts, and the incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder in refugee camps is well over 50%. And of course, often it can lead to conflict because by and large, these are pretty under-resourced people who are moving into places where they may not be welcome. And then you see conflict. So there are huge health impacts of migration and displacement. I think another important thing for reporters, though, is to look at the people who are not migrating, who are not displaced, because research in displacement and migration shows that it's actually the best resourced people in those communities that are ones that can afford to move. It's the elderly, it's disabled people, it's the poorest people that don't have access to transportation, can't walk out of wherever it is that they are, don't have access, and so they're trapped where they are. And the health effects of being trapped in these sort of essentially uninhabitable places are obviously enormous too. So don't just look at the displaced people, look at the not displaced people. And then the last thing I would say is that there's a huge amount, again, that one can do in this situation. So there's a huge literature growing on this idea of planned migration. Sounds like what you're talking about in Panama. It's something we need to be thinking about in the United States and around the world, in our coastal communities. There are places that are simply not going to be viable. And so, starting to really plan how we retreat, what people call managed retreat from sea level rise is a really important topic. And if we do it carefully and with some forethought, we can really reduce the impacts. So that's important, but also, can we develop safety nets and sort of insurance mechanisms before we know which populations are going to be displaced that can help whoever ends up being affected by extreme events in anticipation of the fact that these displacement numbers are probably going to continue to rise. And so, how do we build better safety nets to deal with this growing problem?
Great, thank you both. Before we get to any audience questions or comments, was there anything that you had on your mind that you didn't get to mention during the webinar that you think you wanted to mention before we dive into any questions?
The one thing I would throw out there is just that we do have an organization called the Planetary Health Alliance, which is sort of the backbone organization for this global field of planetary health, with 450 member organizations in over 70 countries. And we certainly welcome anybody to come and join the alliance and get our newsletters and be connected to the planetary health community if they're interested. And we did a bunch of journalist training in our last annual meeting in Malaysia a few weeks ago, and I'm very, very happy to connect with anyone who wants to learn more about the field.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add, and I think actually what Sam just said about migration is actually very important, and it's actually about the health impacts of just being one of those immigrants. Yeah, I think I think it's been super interesting to talk with you about this. I think if anything, Having come from being a kind of, I guess, an investigative reporter to now I feel like I've become a science reporter. I think the instinct to actually understand what's happening in the environment starts with who's doing the damage, and that's where the investigative part comes in. But I think there's actually a deeper, I don't know, I don't want to compare, but I think it's actually worthwhile to try to understand the ecological systems that are getting disrupted, the importance of biodiversity, other factors like that. What I could say to my fellow journalists out there. Happy to take questions. And I'm at Schapiro. If you want to check me out on Twitter, I'm at Schapiro, and on the internet and all that stuff.
We'll give our audience a couple more minutes to think of a question or two. I just wanted to point out that we had a very large audience today, and an eclectic one from locations all over the globe here. We had people join from Indonesia, Kenya, Zambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, Sam and Mark from the United States, and myself from Australia. So it's been a truly global webinar today. So thanks everyone for tuning in. And if you want to learn more about these webinars, do subscribe to our webinar newsletter. You can find that at mongabay.com. Scroll down the page and you'll find a button on the right-hand side that will allow you to subscribe to our newsletter. But yeah, is there any other topics that we didn't get to dive into or detail that you can think of?
I want to know how Mark finds time to write so many books. I'm feeling a little inadequate.
Only 3.
Yeah, well, each one took a while, and yeah, not a lot of sleep. Let's put it that way. But you're running an institute. You got to do studies. It's all. Yeah. They didn't all just come out yesterday. Let's put it that way.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's great, and this is so cool. I got to say, just to build on what Mike said, it's so cool to actually have a global community out there. Hello, everybody. It's actually really nice to see where everybody's coming from, and it's rare to have this kind of idea to talk to everybody who's having these kind of common experiences and common challenges. And so it's great to be here, and thank you, Mongabay, for bringing us together here. A cool publication too, by the way.
Thank you. All right, well, that looks like it's it for our audience. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and close it down. And just to reiterate to everyone, if you missed any of this webinar, it will be published on our YouTube channel in roughly 24 to 48 hours with timestamps. And I'll also include some of the resources that our panelists shared. You will receive a link to this video along with a survey that we'll send, and it'll be published on mongabay.org as well. I just want to say thank you to our wonderful panelists, and also thank you, Johns Hopkins, for promoting this and helping spread the word. And as always, to our audience for participating in this webinar series, which we hope is continuing to inform the work that you're all doing. I do recommend that you follow us and subscribe on YouTube so that you can get updates in the future when we do more discussions like this. But you can also follow us on social media on LinkedIn, Threads, Mastodon, and Blue Sky, where we post announcements also. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you. Cheers.